Good morning and welcome. Thank you for joining us on one of the first panels on the day on what is truly a beautiful morning here in Delphi. And hello to everyone joining us online. My name is Suzanne Lynch. I'm Associate Editor with Politico, based in Brussels. I'm delighted to be chairing this panel on the topic of navigating global instability. So to begin, I'm just going to give a brief introduction to our panelists. So starting on my left, we have Oksana Antonenko, Professor at the European University Institute in Florence. Then Bronwen Maddox, CEO and Director of Chatham House. Stefan Mair from the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. And we'll be joined online by Nick Carter, former UK Chief of Defence Staff, and currently with Hoover Institute and the Atlantic Council. So thank you very much to the panel for joining us. Bronwen, I think I'll start with yourself. It's a big topic, global instability. I don't know where to start in a sense. So maybe just stepping, outside a bit and taking the big picture. What do you identify as the biggest challenge, the biggest threat to global instability as we meet here in Delphi?
Thanks very much. Very good to be here. I think if we do take a step back from the turbulence and the theatricality of the past few days, what we're really looking at is the contest between the US and China, which has been going on for decades now. And it is a contest between two societies, two cultures that really represent very different ways of organizing relations between human beings and pride themselves on their own way, and each mounting an argument that, look, our way is better. And the rise of China that we've seen in recent decades is one of the biggest shifts of power, of relative power in the world, that I think we've seen outside huge wartime. And that is something that was always going to bring right across the planet a huge set of changes in relationships. Something that China has actively explored, and we've seen the extent now of its connectivity in Africa, in Latin America, in the Middle East, in all kinds of places. You turn up and you notice the airport is beautiful, and then you realize from the signs on the wall that China has built it. So, that has been going on for some time, and some of what we're seeing in the past few days, I think, is simply one aspect of America's questioning about how to respond to that.
Yeah,
I'd add two other points quickly, if I can, really quickly. One is, this is a really difficult time to run a country. I'm thinking mainly about democratic countries, but not completely. And Donald Trump is, I think, a symptom of that. But all kinds of governments are trying to say, even in the case of the US, the most successful economy in the world, globalization has not been good for all of its people. And the US is now in this great debate about, well, Trump believes that it wants back the manufacturing jobs it has lost. And indeed, many of his voters, and indeed some of my old American relatives, have lost those jobs in manufacturing. But it has gained so many others in tech. So it is having that internal debate. European countries having another kind of debate about whether voters are prepared to pay more taxes for the kind of social services that they've come to expect, whether they now have to give up those in return for defense. It's a very hard time to run a country, China, though, itself finding aspects of that. So this is leading to a lot of instability. And I would just add just a third point, which Nouriel Roubini, the economist, was making at a dinner last night, and I hope is going to make later in a session this morning, that for all the turbulence we're looking at, we may step back in a decade or two and see actually the tech revolution that is going on as by far the biggest and broadly positive force that is going on for all the political instability, because it really is a revolution that we're living through. Thank you.
No, great. Oksana, picking up on this, you do a lot of work on risk. How are the kind of changes we're seeing now, these kind of seismic structural changes in the balance of power around the world, and the relative decline of some of those more established powers as China has evolved over the last few years? How is that impacting risk? Is it a big issue for a lot of the people you work with?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a brilliant opportunity to exchange views in this beautiful environment. I think we have, Bronwen is completely right. We've been living in the situation of global instability for some time, and there's been a lot of uncertainty about the structural changes and the changes in the balance of power, as well as, more regulatory changes that we've seen, both, in the context of, climate change or other challenges that we are all facing. But I think now we have entered in a new period, which I would call a total instability. It is a situation in which, almost all of the key fundamentals that we've taken for granted, the kind of governance that existed in the Western democracies, the kind of trade relationships that we have seen over many years, the kind of conflicts or the lack of use of military power for the purposes of achieving very narrow national interests, all of that has now changed. And the speed of change is so fast that I think for many businesses or many governments or international institutions, whoever is looking at risk at the moment, the default mode is really to go within itself and to do nothing. We've been talking yesterday about how a lot of American companies at the moment are asking the ships that are coming into the United States to turn back because they simply cannot receive them. They cannot pay tariffs. Similarly, we are now in a situation where we simply do not know in this uncertainty about Trump's policy vis-à-vis Putin and vis-à-vis Russia's war in Ukraine, what is awaiting us in Europe in terms of the likelihood of the expansion and proliferation of this conflict to the broader European theater. And of course, finally, on China, we really are not certain at the moment what signals China is taking, and certainly they are acting in a way which is going to bring more instability rather than less. So this total instability is a new situation for us, and I am afraid, I think that this is going to be with us now for a long time, beyond just President Trump.
Yeah, because, Stefan, as Oksana is alluding to there, we are in a moment of real drama, to put it mildly. Even this morning we've woken up, yes, Trump has moved back, he's retreated on most of his tariffs, but there is now a major trade war happening as we speak between the world's two largest economies. Massive tariffs on China, and China's retaliated with massive tariffs on the United States. So this is not an insignificant moment. And then in Europe, crisis meeting after crisis meeting about the shock, the realization that the United States does not seem to be the security guarantor it once was, and Europe has been left scrambling to try and come up with a response to make sure it's able to frankly defend itself. So Stefan, maybe, how do you assess, particularly the transatlantic relationship at the moment, the instability, and is this really a turning point, or is it a case that we're in the throes of the post-Trump inauguration? We're still not even in the first 100 days, so sometimes it's tempting to get caught up in the detail. But how would you assess things?
No, it's definitely a turning point because I think the reliability, which was really the basic element in our transatlantic relations, has gone. And even if we have another change in 4 years' time, and I said this already yesterday, and we are back, so to speak, to normal as we thought we would have been back after the election of Biden, we might see another reverse in 8 years. So to rely on United States as the guarantor of our security in Europe and our closest partner, I think this is gone. And so this means for Europe that we have to do our very best to ensure our own security. From my point of view, when we talk about Europe in terms of security, it's not the European Union, it's the European NATO members, because we definitely need the UK, and we definitely need Turkey and some other countries out of the European Union to ensure security in Europe. But as I said, reliability has gone, and we have to reassess this situation and really do the utmost to ensure our security by ourselves.
Bringing in Nick Carter is joining us online, and Stefan mentioned there the UK. As we meet back in Brussels, where I'm usually based, there's a meeting at NATO of the Coalition of the Willing. The very fact that there's a meeting of the new Coalition of the Willing at NATO is an indication of the changes that have happened in the last couple of months, that the NATO alliance itself is now it's kind of splintering off into different groups, if you like. How do you assess where particularly NATO stands? We all know here that there has been decades of underinvestment in European defence. The Europeans know this. They're desperately trying now to increase their defence spending and their capabilities. What's your assessment of their chances, quite frankly, of meeting this moment?
Yeah, I think just stepping back for a moment, I think just a couple of observations on what has already been said in the room. It does seem to me that the liberal multilateral system that we've all grown up with is obviously now no more. And so many of the institutions that we have rather assumed quietly were going to fix all of this, of course, have now either atrophied or are moribund, not least the UN Security Council. And I think we're now in a world where it's all about strong men. And whether the strong men are Putin, Xi Jinping, or Donald Trump, or President Erdogan, or whoever else it is, the entry ticket to this new world of strong men is about hard power. And hard power is, of course, what Europe is now waking up and recognizing is going to be necessary to be able to live and survive in this new world order. And I think appropriately, when one reflects on Thucydides, he didn't just talk about the incumbent versus the rising power. He also said, I think, the strongest do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. So I think what Europe is now understanding comprehensively is that actually we're going to have to spend more on defence, and we're going to have to be quite thoughtful about how we spend it. Not least because so many of the capabilities that the United States provides to the Euro-Atlantic area are capabilities that European countries don't have. Whether that's nuclear, whether that's cyber, whether that's intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, whether it's the whole command and control system, theatre level logistics, I could go on. So I think when we reflect on how Europe is going to step up to the plate within NATO, perhaps without the same amount of American contribution in the future, it's going to have to be quite strategic about how it does it. And of course, that's going to depend upon political leadership and political cohesion, because it's going to require our defence industrial base to be rebooted. And of course, that's going to be difficult because there is inevitably a certain amount of national parochialism about the defence industry and the defence sector. But we won't be able to get away with national parochialism in this new world. We're actually going to have to think about it as Europeans. And we're going to have a strategy that leads to what our posture will look like in relation to trying to deter Russia from whatever Russia's next move might be. So these are really profound questions which are not going to be solved overnight. And there is going to be, to the question about risk, a period probably of 3 to 5 years where the risk is going to be quite intense if America is not there for us. And any discussion about the coalition of the willing putting boots on the ground in Ukraine, that's only going to work, as I think our own Prime Minister in the UK said the other day, if there is an American security guarantee for it. European countries are not going to be able to provide the sort of deterrence that will keep Mr. Putin at bay, regardless of what that political settlement, if there is one, on the ground might look like. So I think it's a moment of deep concern, and it's not going to be solved quickly.
Nick, just to come in on that, I think you've hit on the key point, which to me, people are kind of not ignoring, but the reality is that most NATO members, as you said, are not prepared really to give the security guarantee without US involvement. And there doesn't seem to be much of a sense from Washington that that's coming. So are we not in a seriously precarious situation because of that? Or do you think there's some way around this? Or how do you see that playing out?
No, I don't think there is an obvious solution to it. And that, of course, is why President Macron has been talking about the nuclear deterrent and whether the French nuclear deterrent will be contributed to NATO, attributed to NATO in the way that the British nuclear deterrent has been attributed to NATO all these years. So I think that's why that sort of conversation is happening. And of course, you then got to ask some big questions about national resilience. Will people fight? And I think that's a big question. Because I think that, polling would tell you that unless there's a really good national cause, a lot of the younger generation and the coming generation might not fight. So understanding national resilience and understanding how that looks across Europe is going to be really interesting. And I used to sit at the NATO Chiefs of Defence table and, of course, the European Union Chiefs of Defence table. And you always had a divergent opinion between those who had borders that confronted Russia in Eastern Europe, and those, of course, who were Southern Europeans who were looking more towards Africa and the threat from terrorism. And that is the same now in Europe, regardless of how we might think of the Russian threat at the moment. So I think trying to get the sort of cohesion that will be necessary to do as you suggest will be very difficult without really strong leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right that at the moment, particularly in the European Union, as the debate moves to financing defence, there is definitely a division between member states. You know, I think sometimes with the Baltic nations, Poland, who are very vocal, we know their position, but quietly some other countries in the south are not quite as on board with the kind of defence spending and commitments this is going to need. And Stefan, just bringing you in here on this, because Germany, putting on your German hat, obviously we've just had this coalition agreement is finally here, and we're reaching end game in the German coalition talks. Germany is obviously the biggest country in the European Union, the biggest economy. It really matters. I mean, there's been a huge change in Germany even before those elections about their perspective, their views on defence and the need to take a leadership position. I mean, do you think that the German people, I suppose, the German nation has undergone a kind of a sea change when it comes to defence, and it does realise what it wants and needs to do?
As far as I know, there is still a majority of Germans very much supporting that. And when you look at the election results, those parties who were in favor of defence are close to 2/3 in the parliament. But nevertheless, I think the government has to do more to explain to the public why it's necessary to spend so much on defense. We will definitely go beyond 2%. I think we are prepared now to aim at 3.5% of the budget in defense spending. And as soon as it's clear to the population that, of course, spending more on defense means spending less on other areas, we will have a debate on that. And I'm not quite sure whether the government is prepared enough to do this, to engage in such a debate. But I think it's a necessity, and we have to convince the population that's necessary and that security is the basis for economic wealth and welfare.
I mean, Bronwen, I think you touched on this kind of debate about government spending, and this need to spend more on defence is coming up with the reality. The guns and butter debate. Some countries want to spend more on its social care, for example, the welfare state in some extent, and it's not so long ago that the French government was collapsing over the budget. I mean, the budgetary positions of a lot of these countries aren't exactly very strong. I mean, do you think that's? Do you think that is going to be dynamic nationally, or do you think the EU or NATO collectively will be able to kind of overcome those national realities among each country?
It certainly helps if NATO talks up the case for spending more on defence. But the fact is, for 30 years, many European countries, and I'm including the UK, have essentially taken money out of defence and put it into health and pensions and social care and so on, which are things that voters very much like. And meanwhile, the populations are aging and need more of them, even if just at the same level. And it is really hard to persuade voters to take away that stuff, which is a current immediate benefit to them, and put it back into defence, which sounds threatening in all kinds of ways and isn't something they feel they get an immediate benefit from. And it's harder to make that case without, if you like, an immediate war threatening our territories at the moment, though Ukraine is not very far away, and the case that threatens European security is, I think, a strong one. So I think that, that is a really difficult political argument, but it is one that it helps if all countries make together.
Yeah. I was kind of just on picking up on what Nick was saying about these kind of strong men of history that are emerging as the leaders. In terms of Russia in particular, and with your risk hat again, I mean, what do you think the calculation is now for Putin in terms of where this goes, both in terms of maybe the state of the Russian economy, the state of public support for the war, the special operation, as he calls it, in Ukraine? I mean, what are your thoughts there?
Well, I think more generally, we used to, a few years ago, during the pandemic, used to say that the strong men, somehow, authoritarian regimes, are more resilient to crisis, more able to deal with it, while the liberal democracies are more divided, they are less able to, pull together. But now we're actually seeing that the opposite is true. It's the strong men that are continuing to take decisions that are undermining not only the global stability and security and economy, but actually are directly counterproductive for their own interests. And I think it is remarkable how much the decision by the Trump administration or Trump himself now to introduce those tariffs bears so many similarities to the decision that Putin has made by launching the war. Of course, it's in a different scale, in a different category, but it is clearly self-defeating. It is imposing tremendous cost on the country. So, equally, it is very difficult to predict with a strong man, what they're going to do next. Therefore, when you ask to what extent Putin has a rational calculation around how to finish this war, I think the answer is that we simply do not know, because there are no institutional sort of frameworks around it. There's no checks and balances. There's no ability to calculate clearly what he is actually thinking about. What I think we know for sure, and he spelled it out very clearly before he launched his full-scale invasion, is that this war is not only about Ukraine, or I would even say it is primarily not about Ukraine. It is taking place in Ukraine, but the ultimatum that he put forward to NATO in December prior to launching the war was all about rewriting the rules of European security. And this is his aim. So whenever he talks about now that, the ceasefire is only going to happen when the fundamental reasons for this war are addressed, this is what he talks about, this ultimatum that he put forward to NATO in December, which basically talks about rewriting the fundamental rules on which the Cold War ended in Europe. Basically making not only Ukraine, but Europe as a whole a sphere of influence for Russia, where Russia could have a veto over fundamental decisions of European security, and Europe writ large. And I think Trump, my fear is very much sees Europe in the same way. He's not only prepared to give Ukraine to Putin, he's prepared now to discuss without Europeans and without Ukrainians the fundamental issues of European security, one-on-one with Putin, where we are not only at the table, we are on the menu as the Europeans. And I think we need to wake up to this fact that, this is actually a much bigger issue that is happening at the moment. And we have to find out as Europeans, not only trying to get a place at this table, we need to set up our own table. And here General Carter is absolutely right. We have to, from our side, first of all, take care of our own national resilience. We talk a lot about reports by Draghi of how to make Europe more competitive. I'm afraid a report by Niinistö about how to make European societies more resilient is fundamentally even more important, but we barely made any inroads in implementing his recommendations. And secondly, we need to absolutely support Ukraine in this situation without, and General Carter again is right here, but I'm totally convinced that there is no way the Trump administration is going to provide any security guarantees. It's just not going to happen. We have to wake up to this. And we Europeans have to find our own solutions. And indeed, it's going to be expensive. And indeed, it is going to be a bread and butter issue. But if not, we will be on the menu and with all the following consequences.
I mean, Bronwen, just to circle back, I mean, what you spoke about at the beginning, but how does Europe, and I'm including the UK here as well, position itself vis-a-vis United States and China? It's in danger of being sandwiched in, squeezed out, not at the table. I mean, what's your assessment of where that positioning is?
I suspect it's going to get a bit closer to China, but not in a straightforward way. And the European Union has not had, so far, a kind of completely clear position on China. You've had Germany wanting much closer links, France saying, no, thank you. France sort of winning, but I suspect that will begin to change, and the German view have more influence now. So there are things to evolve and to explore, and with India too. It's astonishing how far one gets in these conversations without mentioning India, but which is quietly a player on the side. Though if you put to Indian ministers, as we have at Chatham House, do you want an active role in any of the immediate things, whether Ukraine or Middle East? There tends to be a no thank you. Yes in principle, but no thank you in practice. But let's see. We're seeing in the UK a lot of now positive noises about a free trade agreement and so on. So I think those things will evolve. And the European Union and then the UK separately are just, I think rightly, just waiting to see how the US policies play out on tariffs, because we've been talking about hard power, but the Trump administration has come up against the very hard power of the bond markets at the moment. And the risk of financial crisis is a real constraint. So I think waiting to see how it plays out, but just exploring other relationships is a perfectly good tactic at the moment. The phrase in Downing Street is don't play every ball that comes on the pitch. The British government, all British governments are very fond of football metaphors. But I think that kind of restraint is probably well advised.
Stefan, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I would like to add another task for Europe. It's not only about really taking care for our own security, also support Ukraine, but I think we have also to reach out to countries of the global south, because we need partners for doing so. And to avoid a world which is exists in spheres of influence, we need partners of those who are not interested in such a world. And I think they are partly in the global south, countries like India, Brazil, and others. And hopefully we can build a kind of coalition of countries who are still interested in basic principles of the rules-based order. And we need them, and we have to reach out to them, and we have to make attractive offers to them. Free trade agreements, climate and energy partnerships, what we really have on the table, we have to offer to them.
Yeah, very good point. And of course, China is busy making inroads with a lot of these countries and offering them different contracts, etc. So yes, it's an interesting point. I mean, Nick Carter, bringing you back in on this, how do you read NATO in particular, its focus now outside Europe? Mark Rutte, the NATO chief, has just been in Japan this week. I was listening to him last week in Brussels at the end of a meeting of defence ministers, and he spoke about China at length. He talked about, I mean, bringing up Stefan's point there, you know, if Russia is allowed win in Ukraine, he made the analogy, well, would China be emboldened? You know, so this sphere of influence, NATO sees itself as looking much more beyond Europe and its traditional backyard, if you like. How do you assess that?
Just picking up on an earlier point before I answer that specific question. I mean, I think I rather agree with Stefan about other partners. I mean, my own view is that the US is vaporizing her soft power at the moment. I think that was a term that the Financial Times used the other day. And of course, as the US vaporizes her soft power, it does create opportunities for others of us, not least Europeans, to double down on our own soft power and to be attractive, which of course is the definition of soft power to others. And I think that navigating global instability is fundamentally going to be about relationships and allies. And that is something, of course, that I think President Trump doesn't necessarily understand. And I think we have an opportunity, therefore, to double down on that and get together and perhaps work more constructively with others. So I think there's opportunity to be had there. But in terms of NATO, I mean, I think, you know, it's all well and good looking beyond the Euro-Atlantic area and indeed looking to the Indo-Pacific. And I suspect that that's very attractive for somebody who wants to do business with the United States at the moment. But I do think we need to recognize that the fundamental task of, you know, a NATO that's becoming more European is going to be fundamentally about European security. And European security is threatened, of course, by what Mr. Putin is up to at the moment, but it's also threatened by Africa and indeed by terrorism and by migration and by what could happen further afield in the Middle East. And we need to be quite thoughtful about that because we're only seeing the beginnings of migration, I would suggest. And when you consider that Africa over the next 20 years will represent 25% of the world's population, and when you consider there is now an arc of instability that runs all the way from the Horn of Africa through the Sahel to the west coast of Africa on the Atlantic coast, when you think about the ravages of climate change, when you think about extremism, failed states, the number of coups we're seeing in Africa, I'm afraid the African population is really only going to come one way if we don't think more thoughtfully about how we keep Africans, help them stay in Africa. So I think before NATO starts to think what it might do in the Indo-Pacific, which may well be very relevant in due course, I do think that we need to be reflecting a little bit more on our deeper backyard. And that, of course, actually also includes the Arctic. So there are a whole load of regions that are really relevant to European security at the moment, which are nearer home than the Indo-Pacific. I also am not entirely persuaded that what we're hearing in terms of Trump's rhetoric about Greenland and maybe Canada is necessarily going to encourage China to think that it can have a go at Taiwan. I have always felt, and there probably isn't time to go into this now, that China's strategy is much more likely to be a sort of quarantine strategy for Taiwan and the South China Sea more broadly, rather than a military invasion, for all sorts of very good reasons that the Chinese Communist Party won't want to take the sort of risk, if they don't have to, associated with invading Taiwan. So I think there's a lot going on there, but I do personally feel that NATO needs to start in Europe and then work out from Europe, because ultimately it's going to be about European security at the heart of all of that.
Interesting. I mean, one question I wanted to put to the panelists was about, the title of this session is Navigating Global Instability. And as we have touched on this, the range is overwhelming. And, we haven't even mentioned, I'm thinking the Saudis, for example, just popped into my head then we're talking, are taking such a central role now, for example, vis-a-vis Russia and the United States. But have the international institutions failed us? What role does the United Nations have at the moment? What about these multilateral development banks? I mean, where should the centre of gravity, the fulcrum for governing international relations be, or where do you see it going? Anyone want to come in on that? Or indeed the UN itself? Yes, Stefan?
I think they didn't fail us. I think the multilateral institutions are only as capable as the member states forming these multilateral institutions are willing to do so and to engage. And what we have seen, I think, in the past 20 years is an unwillingness of the member states to reform the institutions, which would be necessary, and to engage in these institutions. So it's less the fault of the multilateral institutions. Of course, it's the fault of the member states. I see it quite difficult, really, to reform the United Nations and other major multilateral institutions. So I think the future is more in unilateral, plurilateral arrangements, coalition of the willings, groupings like G7, G20, or even BRICS. So that's I think, more the future of multilateralism than trying to revive the multilateral institutions we have, because, as I said, they are really also suffering from the great power rivalry, which is coming up. I don't see that.
Okay, I just Bronwen first.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there never was a way of enforcing some of the things that international institutions or rule of law would do, other than by the consent of the countries signing up to them. And if you think of sovereignty, I mean, one of the most fundamental principles, which pretty well every country that signed the Charter of the United Nations has signed up to, that holds good only as long as countries agree to be bound by it or others agree to enforce it consistently. And that is now broken down. But I don't think the institutions have completely crumbled. It is surprising how many cases get brought to the WTO, even without its appeals process working now for many years, and get resolved by countries who still agree to be bound by its terms. And I think you will see countries just begin to evolve institutions in that way. And many countries who are not the US or China say that, look, we are nothing without some kind of rules. We don't have armies. We're never going to be able to enforce what we want by force. We need rules. We need agreements. And you can see whether it is in minilateral or regional groupings or just appropriating UN institutions and agreeing that they just apply to those who agree to be bound by them. You can see middle powers, but smaller countries too, saying, all right, we'll have those. We need something. So let's get what exists there to work. And I'm also encouraged by how much active discussion there is on new rules, whether it is the environment, the plastics treaty, still making some progress, and on governance of tech. All right, that's at a regional level, but it's not nothing.
Oksana, what about yourself? Any views on that?
I think that the crisis of global governance has been with us now for some time. Of course, the Trump factor has accelerated it, but certainly not the key reason for it. I certainly believe that we are now in a situation where the institutions that function on the basis of consensus are simply not able to be agile enough to deal with this total instability I talked about, where the crises are coming at us at every direction with a very high speed. So we need to make institutions more flexible and be able to work together in a pragmatic manner. For example, that relates to EU and NATO. We need to find the way for the EU, as it acquires more military capabilities, to be able to have access to NATO resources. It also, equally applies to, ability to interact in a pragmatic fashion if we are entering in a period of economic crisis, which we might very well do if we look at what's happening with the markets today. The G20 at the end of the day was born out of the need to prevent a global financial crisis, and the countries came together, and that was the only, I would say, most important success of this organization. So if we are now facing a potential economic crisis again, we need to come together in a pragmatic fashion to deal with it. The key challenge and task for us now is to prevent those kind of regional minilateral groupings from solidifying into blocks. What I always call the blobs versus blocks. We need to be in a world of blobs where, there is a pragmatic interaction, but not in a world of blocks. And I think that, in a way, it's very interesting for me now to observe how the organizations like Shanghai Cooperation Organization or BRICS that have been drifting towards an organization which is functioning to basically counter the West in a geopolitical rivalry, is going to react to the fact that the West is imploding, from within in front of our eyes. Does it mean that BRICS itself is going to implode because there will be more chance for pragmatic cooperation and no need for this kind of anti-Western tint that existed there and drove those raison d'etre of some of those institutions. But certainly we need to prevent, as I said, the emergence of those blocks that will proliferate crisis further down the road.
And final word to you, Nick Carter. Any thoughts as we wrap up this session on what you've just been hearing there? I mean, this idea, for example, there's a nice image, you said, the blobs versus blocks. This danger of the fracturing into these different coalitions, and how we have to be kind of mindful of that.
Yes, and I very much agree with something Oksana said earlier in the conversation, which of course is that, regrettably, the rules-based system as we know it has been atrophying for a long time. And whether it's the World Trade Organization, whether it's the ICC or the ICJ, or whether the IMF, which seems a bit discombobulated between worrying about climate change or financial stability, and of course the UN Security Council. And of course the deep irony of all of this is that these institutions, which were created by the United States and our allies after World War II, actually led to much greater US prosperity. And it's really rather ironic that the US perhaps ignores them to the degree that the US has really ignored them since 9/11. And I think that's extraordinary. But the bottom line is that we are, I think, heading for a world that's going to be more regionalized and more sphere of influence-ized than globalized. And that goes back to the point I made earlier about soft power and about attractiveness. And I think that there are opportunities for those of us who are perhaps pursuing the middle ground, aka Europe, with the UK in support, I'd hope, to be able to achieve some success in all of that. I also think, is this a profound change that's going to last? I think it was said earlier in the conversation that perhaps we should expect it to happen beyond President Trump. I'm not necessarily sure of that. I think that Newton's third law probably applies. There will be a reaction to this action. And I'm hopeful that from within the Republican Party, we will see something different. And I think that will happen when they realize the difficulties they're going to have of winning anything in the midterms. And they won't be able to dump this on the Democrats this time round. It's a Republican problem, this, and only they can acknowledge that. So I don't know, I'm more optimistic perhaps than some might be. And I think that we're going to have to tough it out for the next 18 months, recognise the opportunities, work together, inverted commas, as a coalition of the willing. And I think that things can perhaps materialise in a positive way as a consequence of all of that. Thank you.
Okay, Nick Carter, thanks very much for those final thoughts. A reminder that we do have the not so small matter of elections that will dictate a lot of, most places in the world, of where we go geopolitically. So thank you very much for the panel, for that really lovely, wide-ranging discussion actually to get us started here this morning. Thanks for your attention here in the room, and for those of you joining us online. Please do stay in your seats because the next panel will be starting. Shortly. Thank you again.